to make a mold is making a brush-on mold, and we're going to use the Rebound 25, which is also platinum silicone, has a mix ratio of 1:1 by volume. But unlike the pour-on mold, we're going to actually be brushing layers of material onto our model. This first layer we're applying in what's called a stipple technique, where we stippling the material in a very thin application to capture the detail. You can already see that this is a more time-consuming application method. However, it does save a lot of material. The first layer is now allowed a partial cure before applying additional layers. Also keep in mind that each layer will require a partial cure before adding more material to our mold. Beyond this layer, we're going to have to reapply another 5 layers to build up the necessary thickness that is required for a brush-on mold. So as you can see, multiple layers are going to take us much longer than a simple mix and pour over the model. Now, if you would like to see how a full brush-on mold is made with a support shell, you can simply click on the link, and that's going to take you to a full brush-on video using the Rebound 25. And before we start applying any of the support shell material, of course, we got to trim back the flange around our model and peel some of that silicone off. So you can see there is some waste. And then we're going to build up a separation wall that we're going to build up our support shell over. This is Sculptix soft oil-based clay, very easy to work with and manipulate. You can see I build up a wall of the Sculptix, onto which one we're going to put some sonite wax. Make sure that the plasti paste doesn't stick to any of these. And then we're going to mix our plasti paste too. The plasti paste too has a very convenient by volume mix ratio of 1 part A to 2 parts B. Once we dispense the material, we can go ahead and mix it thoroughly, scraping the sides and scraping the bottom off our mixing container, and then get it out of the mixing container. It is exothermic and will heat up, so we get it out of the mixing container and then spread it around using a chip brush. Once the material is applied, I follow it up by using some isopropyl alcohol to soften the edges. The first side of our support shell is now allowed to cure for 90 minutes before proceeding on to the second half. Now we can simply remove the Sculptix oil-based clay from the first half of the support shell. Sonite wax is applied to the first half of the support shell to make sure that the two halves do not bond together. And then we're going to proceed to mix a second support shell side. And again, I'm doing this in 2 batches just because of my own preference. And you can simply apply the material, brush it around, and then smooth it out. Overall, you can see that this brush-on technique took much longer to make the mold than it was with the pour-on mold technique. After a 6-hour cure for the Rebound 25 and a 3-hour cure for the 2 sides of the Plasti Paste 2 support shell, we're finally ready to demold this project. And as you can tell, just the curing of these materials took way longer than the entire setup and making of the box mold that we created earlier. All right, let's take a look at our brush-on mold that we created here. Now, the total working time we spent on this mold was 3 hours. That's with the brush-on and making of the support shell. There was additional 12 hours that was spent on the in-between the layers and waiting for the material to cure. So total time invested in making this mold is 15 hours. The material cost for this mold is a lot less than the material cost for a block mold. It cost us $58 using 2 different materials to create this brush-on mold. A lot less material was used. Now, why is it good to make a brush-on mold, and when would you do it, and when wouldn't you do a brush-on mold for your application? something that I consider is always the size of the models that I have. If I'm working on models that are larger than a foot and up, anything 5-6 feet, I always consider making a brush-on mold because it's going to use a lot less material. It's going to be a lot lighter for me to handle in the casting process. You have to think about those things ahead of time. Now, when wouldn't I make a brush-on mold? If you're working on a very small piece, you don't want to invest countless hours in making a tiny, tiny brush-on mold. It's just a waste of time. Instead, you would just put a mold box around it and pour it. So keep those things in mind when making that consideration. There is a lot less material that we spend on making this brush-on mold, which means the material cost savings versus a block mold are really great. Also, the lightweight of the mold, considered how much a block mold weighs, makes this type of mold much easier to handle. And also keep in mind some of the cons to a brush-on mold, the time consuming aspect that it takes to make the mold, the multiple materials that we use for the mold itself. We do need to make a support shell, as well as the skill level that's required to make a brush-on mold versus a block mold. There are some chances for delamination of layers, so you really have to understand the chemistry of the material that you're working with and the working times. So let's go ahead now and jump into the cavity pour mold.